To Kill a Mockingbird begins as a memory. The narrator, Scout Finch, looks back on her childhood in the small southern town of Maycomb, Alabama, during the Great Depression. At first, her story seems to be about ordinary things: summer days, neighborhood rumors, family life, and the strange people children try to understand before they know how complicated the world can be. But beneath that ordinary surface lies a deeper story about justice, fear, prejudice, innocence, and moral courage. Scout does not begin with a full understanding of these things. She begins as a child, quick-tempered, curious, and intelligent, moving through a world she thinks she knows. What gives the novel its power is that we learn alongside her. The town of Maycomb, with its porches, gossip, routines, and unspoken rules, becomes the setting for one of literature's most enduring lessons: that goodness is often quiet, that cruelty may hide behind respectability, and that seeing clearly is one of the hardest forms of bravery. Scout lives with her older brother Jem and their father, Atticus Finch. Their home is modest but steady, shaped less by wealth than by intelligence, dignity, and love. Atticus is a lawyer, widowed, thoughtful, and morally serious. He does not speak dramatically, but when he speaks, his words carry weight. He believes in fairness, restraint, and treating every person with respect, even when the world around him fails to do the same. Scout admires him, though as a child she does not always understand him. Jem, slightly older and more imaginative, moves between childhood play and the first uneasy steps toward maturity. The Finch family is also supported by Calpurnia, their black housekeeper, whose care, discipline, and practical wisdom make her an essential part of the household. Together they form a small, but deeply rooted family unit, one that gives Scout a sense of safety even as the world around them begins to reveal its harsher truths. One of the first great mysteries in Scout's childhood is the figure of Boo Radley, the reclusive neighbor who almost never leaves his house. To the children, Boo becomes a legend made of whispers, dares, and half-believed stories. He is described as monstrous, ghost-like, and dangerous, not because they know him, but because they do not. Maycomb's gossip turns absence into myth, and Scout, Jem, and their friend Dill become fascinated with the Radley house. They invent games about Boo, speculate about his life, and try to lure him into appearing. In these scenes, Harper Lee shows how easily fear grows around what is hidden. Boo is not a person to the children at first. He is an idea, a shadow filled with imagination. This childish misunderstanding matters deeply because it prepares the novel's larger lesson, that people are often judged not by truth, but by rumor, distance, and fear. Much of the early part of the novel moves with the rhythms of childhood. Scout fights at school when classmates insult Atticus. Jem acts older than he is. Dill arrives in summer full of stories and fantasy. The children roam, imagine, quarrel, and invent adventures. Yet, even in these lighter moments, the world is quietly teaching them. When Scout finds gifts hidden in the knothole of a tree near the Radley house, gum, pennies, small carvings, and other tokens, a new possibility begins to emerge. Someone is reaching out to them, not with harm, but with awkward kindness. Boo Radley, the figure of fear, begins to shift almost invisibly into someone human. This matters because Lee does not teach moral understanding through lectures alone. She lets children feel their way toward it through experience, discovery, and the painful correction of false assumptions. Atticus Finch stands at the center of the novel's moral universe, not because he is perfect in some unrealistic way, but because he consistently chooses principle over comfort. He teaches Scout and Jem not through grand speeches, but through example and quiet explanation. One of his most famous lessons is that you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. This idea becomes one of the novel's guiding truths. For Atticus, empathy is not sentimental softness. It is a disciplined way of seeing. It requires patience, humility, and the willingness to resist easy judgment. In a town filled with prejudice and inherited assumptions, that way of seeing is radical. Scout does not absorb it all at once. Like most children, she hears before she fully understands. But the reader senses that Atticus is preparing her for a world in which moral clarity will matter more than innocence. One day, a rabid dog appears in the neighborhood, moving strangely down the street while the town watches in alarm. Sheriff Tate arrives but, to the children's surprise, asks Atticus to take the shot. Scout and Jem have never seen their father as a marksman. To them, he is simply old, calm, and bookish. Yet Atticus raises the rifle and kills the dog in one clean shot. The scene matters not only because it surprises the children, but because it symbolizes something larger. The dog is an obvious danger moving through the center of town, something everyone fears, but few know how to confront. Atticus does not step forward for glory. He steps forward because someone must. Later, Miss Maudie explains that Atticus was once known as the deadest shot in Maycomb, and that he chooses not to boast about abilities that give him power over others. This revelation teaches Jem and Scout that true strength often hides itself in modesty. The novel shifts into its central moral conflict when Atticus agrees to defend Tom Robinson, a black man accused of raping a white woman named Mayla Ewell. In the world of Maycomb, this decision changes everything. Atticus is insulted, criticized, and socially isolated by people who believe that merely defending Tom is an offense against the racial order. Scout and Jem feel the consequences at school and in public. Other children repeat the prejudices they hear at home, and Scout is forced to confront hatred she does not yet fully understand. Atticus explains to her that he could not live with himself if he refused the case. He must do what is right even if he knows he may lose. This is one of the most important ideas in the novel. Courage is not the belief that you will win. It is the decision to act honorably even when defeat is almost certain. As the trial approaches, the Finch children become increasingly aware of how deeply prejudice shapes Maycomb. People who appear respectable speak casually and confidently about Tom Robinson's guilt before hearing any evidence. Social lines harden. Race determines expectation more than truth does. Scout and Jem, still young enough to believe that justice should be obvious, struggle to understand how so many adults can be so certain without reason. Their confusion is part of the novel's emotional force. Children expect consistency from the moral world before they learn that adults often fail their own principles. Scout especially begins to understand that goodness in private life does not always translate into fairness in public life. A person may be kind to neighbors and cruel in judgment. The town's judgment on Tom exists before the trial begins, and this reality hangs over everything like a shadow. Around this same time, Jem and Scout have a painful encounter with Mrs. Dubose, an elderly, bitter woman who insults Atticus with cruel language. Jem, furious, destroys her camellias, and as punishment Atticus makes him read to her every afternoon. The experience is miserable, and only later do the children learn that Mrs. Dubose was dying and fighting a morphine addiction before death. Atticus tells them she was the bravest person he ever knew because she was determined to free herself from the drug before she died, even though the struggle caused immense pain. This lesson deepens the children's understanding of courage. Up to now, they might have imagined courage as physical boldness or dramatic conflict. Atticus teaches them that real courage often looks like enduring a private battle with dignity. This prepares them, and the reader, to understand courage in more complex forms throughout the story. The night before Tom Robinson's trial, Atticus goes to the jailhouse alone to protect him from a possible lynch mob. Jem, Scout, and Dill secretly follow and find themselves in the middle of one of the novel's most frightening scenes. A group of men arrives, tense and threatening, prepared to take Tom by force. Atticus stands in their way, calm but unyielding. He knows the danger. He also knows that reason may not be enough. The children's arrival changes everything, especially Scout's innocent conversation with Mr. Cunningham, one of the mob members. By speaking to him not as part of a crowd, but as a person she recognizes, she breaks the mob's spell. He is reminded, however briefly, of his humanity. The men disperse. The moment is remarkable because it shows how violence depends on anonymity, collective emotion, and moral surrender, and how simple human recognition can interrupt it. The trial of Tom Robinson becomes the emotional and moral center of the novel. Scout, Jem, and Dill watch from the colored balcony, physically separated from the white courtroom below, a detail that quietly reinforces the racial divisions at the heart of the case. The proceedings begin with outward order and legal formality, but as testimony unfolds, the deeper injustice becomes increasingly clear. Mayla Ewell, the accuser, is poor, lonely, and trapped in a brutal household. Her father, Bob Ewell, is vicious, ignorant, and eager to protect his own power. Tom Robinson, by contrast, is respectful, gentle, and clearly frightened by the machinery of white judgment surrounding him. Atticus examines the evidence patiently and exposes contradictions in the Ewell story. Step by step, he makes it clear that Tom could not have inflicted the injuries Mayla suffered, and that Bob Ewell himself is the far more likely source of violence. One of the novel's moral complexities lies in the figure of Mayla Ewell. She is not innocent, yet she is also not simply powerful. She is lonely, abused, neglected, and trapped within a cruel social structure that gives her little dignity of her own. When she reaches toward Tom Robinson for human kindness, she violates the racial code of her society and becomes terrified of the consequences. Her accusation against Tom is both a lie and a desperate act of self-preservation. Scout does not fully grasp all of this at once, but the reader is invited to feel the tragedy of Mayla's life without excusing the destruction she causes. Harper Lee refuses easy moral categories. Even the people who do terrible harm are often themselves shaped by fear, pressure, and degradation. This complexity makes the injustice more painful, not less. When Tom Robinson testifies, the tragedy of the case becomes unmistakable. He explains that he often helped Mayla with small tasks because he felt sorry for her. That sentence, innocent in one sense, becomes dangerous in the courtroom because a black man saying he felt sorry for a white woman challenges the racial hierarchy on which Maycomb depends. Tom describes how Mayla asked him inside, made advances toward him, and was then discovered by Bob Ewell. His testimony is truthful, but truth alone cannot overcome prejudice in the world he inhabits. Atticus's defense is logical, careful, and morally compelling. He reminds the jury that courts are supposed to be the one place where all men are equal. Yet the novel makes us see how fragile that ideal is when society itself is committed to inequality. Despite the clear weakness of the prosecution's case, the jury convicts Tom Robinson. The verdict shatters Jem, who had still believed that evidence and fairness would prevail. Scout, younger and less certain of legal logic, feels the sorrow but does not yet fully experience the collapse of faith that Jem does. For Atticus, the verdict is painful but not surprising. He knew what he was facing. Even so, the moment is devastating because the courtroom had briefly created the hope that reason might triumph. When that hope is crushed, the reader feels not only the injustice done to Tom, but the larger truth that innocence and truth are often powerless when prejudice has already decided the outcome. The black members of the community stand as Atticus leaves the courtroom, a silent gesture of respect and gratitude that becomes one of the novel's most moving moments. The trial changes the children. Dill is sickened by the casual cruelty he has witnessed. Jem is angry, wounded, and unable to reconcile the world he thought he knew with the injustice now made plain before him. Scout, though still more innocent, begins to understand that moral clarity does not guarantee social power. The adults around them offer different explanations, many of them evasive or compromised, but Miss Maudie gives perhaps the wisest one. She tells the children that some people in Maycomb did try to do the right thing, the judge, Atticus, and others who at least allowed the case a real hearing. Her point is not that the verdict was acceptable, but that moral progress is often partial, fragile, and hard-won. This does not erase the loss. It simply teaches that despair is not the only possible response to injustice. Soon after the trial, Tom Robinson is killed while trying to escape from prison. The official explanation is simple enough, but emotionally the meaning is devastating. Tom had been placed inside a system that had already declared his life expendable. His attempt to flee is an act of desperation, not proof of guilt. For Atticus, Scout, and Jem, the news is another blow. It confirms that the injustice of the verdict was not abstract. It has ended a human life. Tom's death turns the courtroom tragedy into a permanent moral wound. The possibility of appeal, of correction, of future fairness vanishes with him. Harper Lee keeps the scene restrained, which only makes it more powerful. Some losses are too great for dramatic language. They sit in silence and sorrow. Humiliated by Atticus during the trial, Bob Ewell begins seeking revenge. He spits in Atticus's face, threatens him, and makes himself a lurking danger at the edge of the family's life. Atticus underestimates him at first, assuming his anger will burn out into cowardice. But Scout, Jem, and the reader feel the threat lingering. Ewell is a man without dignity, but not without malice, and wounded pride can become especially dangerous in someone who has little else to lose. The novel now moves toward its final convergence, bringing together the courtroom injustice, the children's fear, and the still unresolved mystery of Boo Radley. The world that once seemed divided between childhood games and adult seriousness is closing into a single, more dangerous reality. On Halloween night, Scout and Jem walk home through the dark after a school pageant. Scout is dressed in a cumbersome ham costume, which limits her vision and movement, turning the ordinary night into something strange and half-blind. Along the way, they are attacked. In the confusion, Scout hears struggle, fear, and violence, but cannot clearly see what is happening. Bob Ewell has ambushed them, determined to harm Atticus through his children. The scene is terrifying because it brings the ugliness of adult hatred directly into childhood space. But in the chaos, another figure intervenes. The attacker is stopped. Jem is injured. And when Scout finally begins to understand what has happened, the old mystery of Boo Radley enters the story not as fantasy, but as truth. The children are saved by Boo Radley. The figure who had lived for so long as a neighborhood legend appears at last as a shy, gentle, frightened man who has quietly watched over them. Boo is not monstrous. He is deeply human. He had given gifts in the tree, covered Scout with a blanket on a cold night, and now, at the greatest moment of danger, he has protected them. Scout's long arc of understanding reaches its most beautiful point here. The person she once feared becomes someone she sees with compassion. The lesson Atticus tried to teach her, that you must stand in another person's shoes to understand them, is now fully alive in experience. Boo Radley, hidden from society and judged by rumor, turns out to be one of the novel's truest mockingbirds, harmless, gentle, and undeserving of harm. The title of the novel comes from Atticus's warning that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird. The mockingbird symbolizes innocence, gentleness, and those who cause no harm, but whose goodness is vulnerable to cruelty. Several figures in the novel carry this meaning. Tom Robinson is a mockingbird, destroyed not because he did wrong, but because prejudice needed a victim. Boo Radley is another, injured by fear, gossip, and isolation despite his kindness. Even the children, in their innocence, carry something of the same vulnerability as they move through a world shaped by adult moral failure. The symbol gives the novel its emotional coherence. it is not only about racism or childhood or small-town life. It is about what happens when innocence meets injustice and whether compassion can survive in such a world. After the attack, Sheriff Tate decides not to expose Boo Radley to public attention. Though the legal truth is complicated, Tate understands that dragging Boo into the spotlight after his act of rescue would be another kind of cruelty. Atticus, ever committed to honesty, struggles with this at first, but Scout understands before he does. She realizes that exposing Boo would be like killing a mockingbird. The ending is morally subtle. It is not a rejection of justice, but a recognition that law alone is not the whole of moral life. Mercy, protection, and understanding also matter. In this final decision, Scout shows how much she has grown. She is no longer simply repeating Atticus's lessons. She is living them. At the very end, Scout walks Boo home and then stands for a moment on the Radley porch, looking out at the neighborhood from his point of view. It is a simple physical act, but it completes the novel's deepest lesson. From there she imagines the years as Boo might have seen them, the children playing, the changing seasons, the small dramas of daily life. This act of imagination is really an act of empathy. Scout has learned to step outside herself, outside rumor, outside fear, and into another person's lonely perspective. In doing so, she reaches a kind of moral maturity. The world is still unjust. Tom Robinson is still dead. Prejudice has not been defeated. But Scout has gained something essential, the ability to see human beings clearly, even when society tries to hide them behind labels and fear. To Kill a Mockingbird endures because it joins the innocence of childhood with the deepest moral questions of adult life. It asks what justice means in a world shaped by prejudice, what courage looks like when defeat is likely, and how compassion survives in a society that often rewards cruelty. Through Scout's eyes, we learn that evil does not always appear monstrous and goodness does not always look grand. Sometimes courage is a lawyer standing alone in front of a mob. Sometimes it is a child speaking to a frightened man as a person. Sometimes it is a hidden neighbor stepping from the shadows to save two children. Harper Lee's novel reminds us that to see clearly is itself an act of moral courage. And once seen clearly, innocence becomes something sacred, something the world must learn, however imperfectly, not to destroy.